Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for attending the Weed Science Program update. This is part of our new series, just for every program to update our clientele. So my name is Brent Sellers. I'm the weed extension specialist for the state of Florida, specializing in range and pasture. And what I wanted to do today was give you kind of an update on my students and then touch on some of the research that we've conducted over the past year on perennial peanut, smut grass, and grass weed control and Bermuda grass. So two of my current students are Jose Diaz and Olivia Zugay. Jose is my PhD student. He's the one that's focusing on smut grass management. Olivia is working on grass weed control and Bermuda grass. And then Logan is my former student that just finished up in December, and he is currently working for Dow AgriSciences in College Station, Texas, working in Enlist Cotton. But I've heard recently that he's actually being transferred to Lubbock, Texas, to a temporary sales position in pastures and range in Texas. So that's pretty exciting that he's actually able to get back into his field that he did his master's in. So Logan actually did quite a bit of research for his master's on perennial peanut, weed management and perennial peanut. For those of you that aren't aware of what perennial peanut is, it's a tropical, subtropical legume that was introduced from Brazil. It's been used extensively throughout pretty much the northern part of the state. There's been a little bit of planted in this part of the state as well, but also in Georgia. And it reproduces vegetatively primarily. There is some seed production, but pretty much vegetative reproduction. And this makes it a little bit more expensive than some of our traditional forages to get it established. And of course, with any cropping system, weed management is one of the main disadvantages to growing it. And there's been a lot of work done with weed control and perennial peanut, and Imazapic was by and far the standard herbicide for perennial peanut weed control. It's been used extensively, and then in the mid-2000s we were able to get 2,4-D labeled at a pint per acre, and then also use Velpar at a pint per acre 3 days after clipping. So those were our three herbicides that we could use for broadleaf weed control. Imazapic would also pick up the sedges, which was beneficial. Then the only other thing we could use for grass weed control was clethodim, which is Select Max or Arrow. So by and far, those were the main herbicides that have been used and recommended throughout the state. And of course, using those herbicides over and over again, we've kind of resulted into a weed shift. So we've shifted from species that were susceptible to Imazapic and 2,4-D to ones that are more tolerant. Like the one in the picture, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little purple flower on there with a plant that's kind of sticking up above the perennial peanut, and that is red spiderling. And that's one that's been fairly difficult for growers in this part of the state as well as up in North Florida. But we're also having issues with blackberry briars. So 2,4-D and Imazapic are not active on those species. So we're looking at alternatives to pick up blackberry briars. And then hairy indigo. So we have difficulties removing grass from a grass, right? Well, this time we're removing a legume from a legume. So you can see the challenges that we have with removing hairy indigo from perennial peanut. Well, several years ago, we're messing around with our alleys, trying to clean up our alleys in between our plots, and we realized that we could see some tolerance to glyphosate and triclopyr along the edges of those plots. So we decided to look at this a little bit more closely. So we looked at glyphosate and triclopyr at various rates, and we looked at this at two locations. One is Awful Springs, which was a UFP's cultivar that was planted in about 2012, but they harvested the rhizomes in 2014. We started this work in 2015. So they were disturbed, and then they had about a year of regrowth before we started the experiments. We also looked at 4 varieties here on the research station, and those were planted in 2005 and then pretty much undisturbed since that time. We used fairly small plots, 5 by 5 feet. We made our applications 14 days after clipping. a sprayer output of 30 gallons per acre. Then we estimated a crop injury at 7, 15, 30, and 60 days after treatment. I'm only going to show 30 and 60 days today. And then collected biomass from the center quarter meter square of each plot at 60 days after treatment. So this is some of the data that we collected from Zoffo Springs. Remember, this is the site where the root system was disturbed about a year before we started the trial. And you see what we kind of expect. As we increase glyphosate rate from 0.125 pounds per acre to 2 pounds per acre, we see a jump in crop injury. But even at a half a pound per acre, we're seeing less than 20% injury. So what we typically say in weed science is if it's less than 20% injury, the growers are less likely to actually observe it in the field if it's a complete application across the entire field. Once you get above 20%, that's when growers start to recognize that there's something going on. So when we go up to a pound and then 2 pounds, you see an increase to 25 and then upwards of 40% injury from glyphosate. And what we're really interested in then is the biomass. How is that affecting your biomass long term? This is 60 days after treatment and taking the center quarter meter square from each plot. And we see a 20% reduction. That's what the red lines indicates, 20% reduction in biomass 60 days after treatment. And that was from estimated to be around 0.56 pounds per acre. So about half a pound per acre, you see a 20% reduction in the UFP's biomass from a disturbed root system. All right, so Sedona, this is where we had 4 different varieties. This is 30 days after treatment, and we did have a variety by glyphosate rate interaction. So that's why we separated out the 4 different varieties at that time. And what we see is that Florigraze is the least susceptible, or is the most susceptible to glyphosate, because our I-20 value, the amount of glyphosate to cause 20% injury, was 0.9 pounds per acre. Then ONA 33, which is an unreleased variety, UF Tito, and then EcoTurf was actually the most tolerant, surviving at 20% injury at 1.4 pounds per acre. So quite a bit more than what we saw with UFPs. We would look at injury at 15, 30, and 60 days. The trends are kind of the same. When you average this over all glyphosate rates, EcoTurf was the most tolerant with only 11% injury. Florigraze was the most susceptible with 17% injury at 30 days after treatment. By 60 days after treatment, everything was less than 20%. But really what I wanted to point out in this table is look at the peanut biomass of the 4 varieties. EcoTurf, ONA 33, and UF Tito were all the same. And then you had more than a 50% reduction with Florigraze overall. Then when you look at the weed biomass, this is kind of interesting to me, where the EcoTurf, ONA 33, and the UF Tito had 40 to 80 grams per square meter versus the amount of weeds in the Florigraze. And we'll see this again with the triclopyr data, but for whatever reason, the Florigraze seem to not compete very well with the weed species that we have. So this is perennial peanut biomass, which is the line on the top, and then the weed biomass, which is the line on the bottom. And again, if we focus on the line, that's a 20% reduction in peanut biomass. And in this case, it was around 2 pounds of glyphosate to result in a 20% reduction in biomass of peanut. So substantially different than what we saw with UFPs. In a disturbed root system, it only tolerates a little over half a pound, but in a very well established undisturbed root system, it's tolerating up around 2 pounds. So quite a bit of difference between the two. I think what maybe tells the story a little bit better is what we're referring to as a perennial peanut to weed biomass ratio. So to the left of the red line in the graph, this is indicating that you're seeing competition from the weeds. So there's not enough herbicide to control the weeds, so you have more competition from the weeds left of the line. When you get to the right of the line, we're seeing less biomass from the perennial peanut from increased herbicide injury. Okay, so that's kind of our break-even point where we have enough weed control, but not too much herbicide to cause damage. So somewhere around 1.1 pounds to the acre would be our kind of our break-even. So we see a 20% yield reduction at 2 pounds, but our break-even's right around a pound. All right, switching to triclopyr, kind of the same trend we saw with UFPs at Zalco Springs, except we see 20% injury or less with a half pound of triclopyr, but once we get above a pound or above, then we get above that threshold of 20%, and that held true throughout the 60-day evaluation period. And then 20% reduction in biomass would be just under a half pound of triclopyr. So it'd be a pint rate to the acre, just under a pint rate to the acre of Remedy Ultra would result in a 20% reduction in peanut biomass. Same with ONA. We did have a variety by triclopyr rate interaction as we did with glyphosate, and instead of Florigarase being the most susceptible, is actually UFTito with triclopyr, and then but EcoTurf, just like with glyphosate, was the most tolerant. So it seems like EcoTurf seems to be the most tolerant to the herbicides that we're using overall. On the same table I showed you with the glyphosate, we did have some differences at 15, 30, and 60 days after treatment, though, with UFTito showing more injury than the other varieties at 15 days, and then at 30 and 60 days as well, with EcoTurf showing the least amount of injury at 30 days, but then ONA 33 showing the least amount of injury at 60 days. And just like we saw with the glyphosate data, we'd have less peanut biomass in the Florigarase plots and more weed biomass in the Florigarase plots than the other varieties. And again, I'm really thinking there's something going on with this variety being a little bit more susceptible to weed competition. So for peanut biomass, which is top line, and then weed biomass being the bottom line, we saw a 20% reduction in biomass with just under a pound of triclopyr, so we can almost approach that 2 pint per acre rate to control the weeds. And then we did the biomass ratio last time with glyphosate, which ended up with a pretty nice curve. With triclopyr, we never really saw that much of a reduction in biomass to get that bell-shaped curve that we saw with glyphosate. So it seems like we apply triclopyr, we end up with better peanut biomass overall. And these are just some pictures from Zalco Springs. On the left is the untreated, and then we have the pound rate of glyphosate, the half pound rate of glyphosate in the middle, and the half pound rate of triclopyr on the right. So those are some pictures from those plots at 30 days after treatment. So to summarize Logan's work, perennial peanut is fairly tolerant to glyphosate and triclopyr, and we can use those for post-emergence weed control. Some injury can be tolerated when these products are labeled. So right now, these are not actual legal applications to perennial peanut. We are currently working with FDAX and Allball Chemical to get Glyphstar Plus, a supplemental label for use in perennial peanut as a rescue treatment. And then we're also working with Dow AgroSciences to get Remedy Ultra, a supplemental as label as well. But overall, we feel like the age of the stand is going to impact tolerance. So this is something that you're going to want to do within the first 3 or 4 years after establishing perennial peanut. And we're going to have to use some diligence and maybe use some spot applications where blackberry briars have come in. Okay, I'd like to switch gears and talk about Jose's work on smut grass, and it's going ahead on its own. But this is something that people have been working with over the past several years. I think most people realize this is one of our most tenacious weed species that we deal with in pastures. It is invasive and native to tropical Southeast Asia. It's ranked as one of our top 3, if not our top 2 weeds in the state. And it's unpalatable, so cattle don't use it very much with a lot of seed production. But we have found over the last several years that, and I think people realize this as well, mow it or burn it, then it becomes more usable and the cattle will graze it with similar forage qualities to Bahia grass. So we've been looking at this since the 1950s. I don't know what's going on with this computer. All of a sudden it's going ahead on its own. With mechanical, cultural, and biological methods. Fortunately, the biological method hasn't worked out that well. And get rid of this clicker. But chemically, the only thing that's really working is hexazinone, and that's basically our only option for selective control of smut grass and perennial grass systems. And we end up with fairly good control, but what we're finding is it's fairly inconsistent. And it costs around $40 to $50 per acre versus $8 to $16 per acre for other broadleaf weed control methods. So basically, ranchers are forced to accept losses, and it will kill oak trees from time to time if it's applied too close to the drip line. But like I said, it is fairly inconsistent, so we do see occasional lack of control in some situations, and we believe it's either leaching out of the root zone or it's because of lack of incorporation. And some of the chemical characteristics of hexazinone is that it's xylem mobile, so it has to be taken up by the roots, and there's limited foliar absorption and uptake by the plant. So that's kind of the key. We need rainfall to get the herbicide into the soil for root uptake, and but too much is going to be bad too. And this is what we're trying to focus on. It's really trying to determine how much rainfall we need to get the herbicide into the soil, and then how much is too much that it actually leaches out of the root zone. So that's kind of what Jose was looking at this past year in a couple preliminary trials. He did this twice under a greenhouse setting. We collected plants from the field, separated them, and transplanted them in pots into field soil. So we simulated rainfall onto those pots after we sprayed a pound to the acre of Velpar, and this is 60 days after treatment from the first run, and we calculated that we needed about 2 inches of rainfall before we started to see a drop in control. When we repeated the run, we came up with just over 2.4 inches of rainfall before we saw a drop in control. So this may be a little bit better picture than looking at a graph all the time. So this is from the first run where we saw a drop in control after 1 inch of rainfall. The regression line tells you a little bit different, but these are the results that we saw in the greenhouse. So we also did this in the field because, you know, we can control all we want to in the greenhouse, but we can't control Mother Nature. So we really wanted to look at how smut grass control is impacted by natural rainfall events. So we went out into the field. It was pretty much a solid smut grass pasture, and sprayed weekly starting on April 22nd and continued this until August 26th at 2 different rates, a half pound and a full rate of a pound per acre. And then we recorded rainfall for the entire week after the application. So hopefully we start off with, you know, a pretty nasty situation, but 30 days is normally where we'll see kill. So if we go out 30 days after application and we see a good result, more than likely you're going to see that result carry on until the next year. If you don't see a very good result by 30 days, it's usually a pretty good indicator it's not going to work that well. But these are the results we got from last year, and what we can see from this work is that April 26, we had no rainfall and only 20% control. Go out to June 3rd, we had almost 5 inches of rainfall, 50% control. July 1st, no rainfall, 50% control. All right, so it looks to be that our greenhouse research is really panning out, because when we get out into July, August, which is our normal time frame for smut grass control, and we're within the 1/4 inch to 3 inch rainfall, we averaged at least 65% control overall. Now, we were lucky last year where we could go a little bit earlier in some cases and end up with fairly good control, but we're in a different climate setting where we're getting rainfall early last year. We had active growth of smut grass, and this year I think we might end up with different results than what we're seeing right now from last year. So our preliminary conclusions from Jose's work so far indicate that rainfall after application is definitely impacting the efficacy of hexazinone on the control of giant smut grass. And let me go back once. There's one other thing I wanted to point out in this slide that I forgot to mention. If you look here in the 1st of July, where we got no rainfall, but we got upwards of an inch within a 14-day period, we still ended up with pretty poor control. So this tells me that the hexazinone isn't sticking around very long in the environment, even if we don't get rainfall incorporation. So either it's breaking down some other way, or it's breaking down by sunlight. So there are a couple other avenues for that herbicide to break down. All right, so some of Jose's future research that's starting again this year is additional rainfall studies in both the greenhouse and the field, and then also look at the impact of fire, grazing, and Velpar. And then we're actually going to go out and start wiping smut grass with the rotowipers and try to figure out what rates of glyphosate and hexazinone are necessary for optimum control. All right, my last topic, and this is part of Olivia's work that she's been working on, is grass weed control in Bermuda grass hayfields. And we've discovered a few years ago that we could use glyphosate 7 days after clipping and have some selectivity that way, but we were really kind of unsure of our rates. I've had producers comment that they can use upwards of a quart per acre. I've never tested up to a quart. I was always a little bit scared of that, so that's kind of where this work came from. So we started this work, actually Olivia started it last year in Gainesville on a coastal variety of Bermuda grass, and we used from 0 to 32 ounces per acre, and we actually started harvesting at 14 days after treatment, but this is what I'm showing you is a cumulative harvest throughout the harvest times that we evaluated. We applied the glyphosate at 3, 7, and 14 days after clipping, so we could look at very soon after clipping, as well as 14 days after clipping, because at 14 days we should have significant regrowth and we should start seeing some injury. So what we see is with 8 ounces at 3, 7, and 14 days after clipping, they were pretty much the same as our untreated control. At 3 days after clipping with 16 ounces, we did see a slight decrease compared to our control, but no decrease with 7 or 14 days after treatment. And even up to 32 ounces, we really didn't see much of a decrease at 7 and 14 days after treatment, but we did at 3 days after clipping. So this is telling us that the coastal variety of Bermuda grass is fairly tolerant to glyphosate overall, much more so than I anticipated. So it's going to be interesting to compare coastal to jigs Bermuda grass this coming summer. So we averaged all that data over all 3 clipping timings, and we do see a decline as we get up to that 32-ounce rate compared to our untreated. But overall, not that bad. If we're trying to salvage a hay field and try to get rid of basil grass, guinea grass, or some other grassy weeds, even like bahia grass, it might be advantageous for growers to use the 32-ounce rate. And then when we look at the data averaged over the clipping times, we do see a slight increase in biomass when it's applied 7 days after clipping compared to 14 days after clipping, because there is a little bit of regrowth by that time point. So Olivia's going to be busy. She's going to be looking at both jigs and coastal Bermuda grass, and then also look at bahia grass response to glyphosate, because we can do a fairly good job on Pensacola using metsulfuron in Bermuda grass hay fields. But Argentine, if that's surviving, that one tends to be a little bit more difficult. So we're looking at glyphosate and metsulfuron together to help pick up bahia grass and Bermuda grass hay fields. We're also looking at basil grass and guinea grass response to glyphosate, as well as other herbicides that are labeled for hayfield production as well. And I believe that ends my presentation, and be happy to entertain any questions. And if there are any questions online, please type them in, and hopefully there will be some. Any questions from the audience? Okay, one question. Sorry, a little bit of difficulty finding the question. What about standing water in pasture when spraying for smut grass? So I actually get this question quite a bit from producers, and I particularly don't like that strategy all that well, but I know people have been saying that for several years. Kind of have a problem environmentally spraying this herbicide when water is standing. Plus, you have the potential for that herbicide to actually run off with the water if you do get more rainfall as well. So people mention spraying Velpar while it's raining. I think that's a fine practice because you're actually ensuring that the herbicide is going to get into the ground. But be cognizant of how much rainfall might be occurring as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Does the audience here have any questions? Figures that you showed about the effect of glyphosate on the biomass of Bermuda grass, when you apply 8 ounces per acre, I guess, you had a little bit of an increase on the biomass. What, is there an explanation for that?
Okay, question from the audience was on the Bermuda grass, where I was showing a slight increase in biomass from applying 8 ounces per acre of glyphosate. So, yeah, a lot of times when we apply sublethal rates of herbicides, you actually will get a bump in biomass. We've seen that with a lot of different herbicides overall. You'll see that with 2,4-D, but we do see that quite a bit.
Is there physiological explanation for that, or we did not know?
Is there a physiological explanation for that? I'm sure there is. But right now it's escaping me. Oh, we got more questions. Does the growth stage of smut grass have any influence on the Velpar application in relation to the rainfall? Short answer is no, because the herbicide has to be taken up by the roots and then translocated that way through the xylem. The growth stage really has no impact, and mowing and burning to date has not shown any influence using Velpar at this point. It's more impacted by rainfall than anything. The only thing I can say about growth stage versus age of the plant, we have noticed that young plants that have established within the past year can't be controlled with a half rate of Velpar versus a full rate. So like in the case of renovation, the year after seeding bahia grass, you can go in with a half rate of Velpar and pick up any of those seedlings that have come up within the same time that bahia grass did. But if you let it go 2 or 3 years after that, you're back up to that full rate that's necessary. or plan on multiple sequential applications over a couple of years. Next question I see is, do you feel that Velpar or Roundup would be better option than a weed wiper? My brain has always told me that Roundup would be better, and I was at a field day yesterday in Okeechobee, and that particular producer told me that he switched to Velpar last year, and he said the jury's still a little bit out on this, but he feels like he got a better response from wiping Velpar than he ever did wiping glyphosate the previous 10 years. So we're going to figure that out. So Jose has his work cut out for him the next couple years trying to figure this out. So I don't have an exact answer, but right now my brain says glyphosate, but my producers are telling me Velpar. I'm going to skip that question. Mike Riffle, I'll get back to you on that. And then, how many days after cutting the Bermuda gave the best weed control with glyphosate? So that's a good question. We weren't really focusing on that at this point. We were pretty much just looking at tolerance, and that was a fairly weed-free pasture, I believe. Yeah, Olivia's shaking her head, yes. So that was a weed-free setting, so we really didn't look at weed control at this point in the Bermuda grass. So that's something that we'll look at this coming growing season. Very good. Thank you for the questions. Are there any others? Okay, if not right now, feel free to email me or catch me later. Give me a phone call. Be happy to answer them at that time. So thank you for attending, and that concludes this presentation. There will be 2 more webinars in May, one on May 9th with Dr. Moriel. This will be his animal science program highlight, and then he will have a second one on May 17th that is going to cover his owner report in the Florida Cattlemen's Journal. So with that, I will sign off. Hope everyone has a great day.